Well, when I was a kid, my grandparents for a little while lived in Idaho. And we would go to visit them every once in a while. So we went up there a few times. So the family all got in the car and we just started driving. And I remember being amazed that my dad knew how to get there. That he could just get in the car, get on the freeway, and arrive at their house a few states away. Of course, I figured it out now. You have freeways, interstates that just kind of go up there. But I just remember being amazed that he knew how to get there. And you know what? I never questioned if we would make it. I had complete, total trust in my dad. And it never even crossed my mind to not trust him. And this is how we can live in relationship with God. And this is what he wants for us. He wants us to live by faith, to trust him completely. But living by faith isn't always easy. When God tells us to do something or tells us to live a certain way, we may hesitate, or we may get started and then get held up, stop somewhere, get stuck along the way. And there may be unknowns on the road ahead. And we may have to face fears as we travel. But another problem is that we tend to rely on ourselves over God. That's our natural instinct. Our go-to method of doing things is to rely on ourselves. We say, I can figure this out. I can do it. I can handle it. When we should look to God for strength and for wisdom and for help. And even when you are trusting God and we're living by faith, we may still suffer pain and injury and sickness, or financial loss, or the loss of friends and family, or other setbacks in life. But one thing is certain, the life of faith is not static. Things in life are always moving and always changing. But we want to be moving in obedience to God. And we want to be learning how to trust him completely. Well, today we're going to see some of this in Abraham's life. He's going to take a road trip of faith. And we'll ride along as he begins to learn what it means to live by faith. So we're going to start this morning in chapter 11, Genesis chapter 11 and verse 27. It says, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So this is the beginning of another new section in Genesis. It tells us of the life of Abraham, or Abram. Now, God will change Abram's name to Abraham, and I will probably bounce back and forth between those two names just out of habit. But there it is. But these verses at the end of chapter 11, they serve as a transition from the early history of the world to the story of God's redemption through Abram's descendant. And this theme of redemption runs through the rest of Scripture. God's salvation through Jesus, Abraham's descendant. But this paragraph is also just a parenthetical summary that introduces the main characters that we're going to be seeing and some things about them before getting back to the main action that we see in chapter 12. And so what do we see here at the end of chapter 11? First of all, we see that Terah is Abram's father. He has two other sons, but one of them dies young, and so Terah then takes guardianship of his grandson, Lot, and cares for him. We also see that Abram and his other brother are married. So Nahor married his niece. You may not have caught that, but it explains that she's the daughter of his brother. So Nahor marries his niece, and Abram married Sarai. Now, we're not told this here, but Sarai is also Abram's half-sister. Same dad, different mom. But there were no laws about this kind of marriage at that time. But that is the situation. We are also told that Sarai is barren. She has no children. And this little bit of information may seem extraneous, not so important, but it is. We may read that and say, why do they say that? But it's important. We need to take notice of it. This is a clue, or you could call it a teaser, of something that's to come. That God will do something big. And then it doesn't say this directly, but it suggests to us that Terah and Abram and the rest of the family were idolaters. They worshiped false gods. You see, they lived in Ur. And then when they started traveling, they stopped in Haran. Now, Ur and Haran, both of these places were both major centers for the worship of the moon god. And so people there worshiped the moon, and most likely, Abram and the rest of his family worshiped the moon as well. We also know that Abram's and Nahor's wives are named after the moon god's wife and daughter. And so it's very likely that they worshiped the moon. And then in Joshua's speech to the Israelites, in Joshua 24, verse 2, when Israel is gathered to renew the covenant with God in the land, once they've come into the land, Joshua says this, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, and they served other gods." And then the last thing we see in this paragraph, in this summary, is that the family moved from Ur and they were headed to Canaan. But they stopped in Haran and they settled there until Terah dies. Now, from this, it sounds like Terah moved the family. And we're not told why they moved. And in the next verses, in chapter 12, we will read of God telling Abram to move, which makes it sound like God told him to move while they were in Haran, not while they were living in Ur. But there are other texts in the Bible that tell us that he was in Ur when God called him and told him to move. In fact, Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7 makes this explicitly clear. He says he was in Ur when God called him and told him to move. And so my understanding is that this intro in the end of chapter 11 here is parenthetical, a parenthetical summary. It's kind of like stuck in there, giving us some information, introducing. And it doesn't exactly fit in the actual timeline of the action, which picks up in chapter 12. So it's kind of just giving us an overview as it starts. And so it's possible that when God called Abraham, when he was in Ur, that Abraham told all of his family and that they decided to go. So Terah then, his father, the head of the household, made a family decision and they all headed out. But then as they were traveling and they got to Haran, Terah decides to stop. And so they stay there and he settles the family there. And then Abraham doesn't leave till his father dies. Stephen also makes this clear. And so it seems to me that Abraham left right away, but then he got held up. Maybe his family was holding him back. Or maybe he was holding on to his family and waiting on them. Whatever the reason, he has this moment of hesitation where he stopped moving. Now, there's a couple important ideas here in this paragraph that I want to pull out. First, God didn't choose Abram because of how good or holy or perfect he was. He was an idolater. He didn't choose Abraham because he had done something special. God chose Abram according to his own will and in his grace. He called Abram out of his old sinful life and into a new life. And you know, that's how it is for all of us, even today. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, "For by grace you've been saved, and that not of yourself." For by grace you've been saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. We are children of God because God had mercy on us and gave us grace. And we aren't better than other people who don't know Jesus. We're all sinners who deserve judgment. But God saved us and gave us grace. He changed us by his grace. And he helps us to live and to obey by faith. The second thing is, in the Bible, Abraham is held up as the example of faith, like the greatest example of faith. And Hebrews 11 lists him off as a hero of faith. But he wasn't always that man of great faith. He was an idolater. And it appears here that he hesitated. And as we continue to read his story, we'll find that he faces challenges, and he will fail more than once. But at other times, he expresses amazing faith. He learned and he grew in faith. And this is part of living by faith. I mean, you might say, well, my faith is small. I struggle. And, I failed. And I think most of us, if not all of us, would say the same thing. But we just need to keep going. Keep trusting God. And God will work in you, and your faith will grow. Live by faith. Well, now let's read God's command to Abram and what he promised he would do for him. Chapter 12 and verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Okay, so what is God's command to Abram? Go. Right? He says, go. And then what did he have to leave behind? What did Abram have to leave behind? Almost everything. I mean, he has to leave his extended family, his friends. He has to leave the life that he had built there. Everything familiar to him and comfortable, and he had to leave his security that all brings. And then where was he to go? Somewhere. Just go. God doesn't tell him. So Abram didn't know where he was headed. He was just to go wherever God showed him. So this was huge. It would take incredible faith to do this. I mean, he was settled where he was living, and he was established, and he was secure. And God tells him to leave it all behind. To go to a completely unknown place. And not just that the place is unfamiliar to him, he doesn't even know where it is that he's going. So God tells him to go, and Abraham is to trust God and go. But God also gives him a promise. You see, if Abram goes, then God will do this for him. So let's look at the specifics of the promise. First, when God makes this promise, he says, I will. And now this is important. We could easily read over this, but this is important. God says, I will. So everything good that happens to Abraham or for Abraham is from God. God is doing this. It won't be luck. It won't be a coincidence. It won't be something he earns by hard work. It's God's doing. God will do this. Also, it is certain that if this condition is met, if Abraham goes in faith, then God will do this for him. Secondly, the promise is that God will make Abram a great nation. So he will have many descendants, so he will be great in number. But this nation will also be great in significance or importance. And at this point, we were just told that Sarai is barren, right? She has no child. So at this point, the fact that Sarai is barren comes into play. Will he believe it? Will Abram believe it? This would be both great and exciting news to Abraham, but it's also an opportunity of faith. It will require faith on his part. But then God also promises that God will bless Abram. He will cause him to be successful and prosperous and to have many descendants. And in general, life will be good. And God will make his name great. And so Abram will be well known. He will be respected. He'll have a great reputation. And Abram will be a blessing. And this is explained a little bit more. And so Abram will be blessed by God, and then others would also be blessed by God based on their relationship to Abraham. And so God will bless those who bless Abraham. In other words, those who benefit Abraham or treat him well, God will benefit them as well. He will give them good. And God will curse those who curse Abraham. In other words, so people who treat Abraham lightly or as if he is insignificant or treat him with contempt or just mistreat him, God will curse him or banish them from the blessing. In other words, he will remove them from blessing. And there's this interesting change, though, in these verses. An interesting change from the plural to the singular. And it's very easy to miss. He says, those, plural, those who bless you, I will bless. versus whoever, singular, or him, or the one who curses you, I will curse. And this is very subtle, but it expresses God's desire to bless many. And all of this blessing of people through Abraham is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. And the relationship people have with Jesus, the descendant of Abraham. It reminds me of John 3, verses 17 and 18. He says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him." That's God's desire, is to save people, to save the many. And he continues, verse 18, "Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God." Those who reject Jesus have rejected God's blessing. And so God told Abram to go, and he gave him a promise. And what did Abram do? Well, he obeyed. Look at verse 4. "So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him." So Abram packed everything up and everyone that he had, and they left Haran. And so this would include his possessions that he had already gathered. God is already blessing him. And it includes the people he'd acquired. Now, this people could refer to workers or servants, and possibly even to converts. If he told them about Yahweh and the call that God had given them and the promise to bless them, this could include converts as well. And then Lot is specifically mentioned. And notice that it says Abram took Lot in verse 5. But before that, in verse 4, it says Lot went with Abram. This explains that Lot chose to go along. Abram was not disobeying God by not leaving all his family. It's possible that Lot was the first convert to believe in Yahweh through Abraham. But they went to Canaan, and God told them, "This is the place. This is the land. I'm going to give it to your descendants." But it's interesting because Abram would live there as a foreigner, as an outsider. The land belonged to the Canaanites, and we're specifically told that here. At this time, the land belonged to the Canaanites. God hadn't removed them yet. And so the land wasn't free for the taking. God promises to give this land to Abram's descendants. This means that Abram must continue to have faith for two reasons. First, Sarai is still barren. He has no descendants. And secondly, the land is occupied. People are already there. They own it. And it won't be given to Abraham's family till sometime later. So he has to trust God. He has to believe God. But Abraham responds in faith. And he builds an altar and he worships God. And we're told that this happened by an oak tree. Now, the interesting thing is in the ancient Near East, large trees were often places to gather for learning and for worship. And it's possible that they thought of the tall trees that reach up into the sky as being a place that connects earth and heaven. But if this was what Abraham was thinking, he was worshiping in the way he knew, but now he was worshiping the one true God. But also, he built a new altar. He didn't just use a pagan Canaanite altar that was built for false gods. He built a new altar, and he's worshiping the one true God. Let's keep reading verse 8. He says, from there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, and with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev, or the wilderness, down to the south. So he continues to travel around the land. He's probably just moving around to provide for his livestock, pasture land. He was a nomad. But when he moves, we're told he also builds another altar so he can worship God. So Abraham, he demonstrates this great faith. He left everything familiar to him and went somewhere completely unknown. God said, go, and he went. That's exactly the right thing to do. And another thing, even though he didn't know where he was going, this wasn't a blind faith. Even though he didn't have all the details, he had God's promise. He knew God would be with him. And he knew that God would support him. It's kind of like, when you're driving in a place that you're semi-unfamiliar with, and you're driving down the road and all of a sudden the road is closed. Like, this is the one way I know to go. And the road is closed and there's a sign that says detour. And you have a choice to make. Are you going to trust that sign? Or are you just going to try and figure it out on your own? Well, you don't know where you're going. Probably a better idea to trust that sign, right? And so you follow the sign, it's a detour, and it takes you here and here and here and all that, and then you find yourself back on your road. You don't know what's ahead or how you're going to get there. You just have to trust the signs. And sometimes God tells us to go into an unknown. He says, do this. And we're like, but what will happen? We don't know. How will it happen? How will this all work out? Well, I don't know. But God says, do it. Like if I'm at work and I am being asked to compromise my Christian principles, to disobey God and to do this or that, you might ask, what will happen if I don't compromise? What will happen if I don't do what my boss is telling me to do because I know it's wrong? What will happen if I obey God? Well, I don't know. But I know what God has told me to do. What will happen if I talk to my non-Christian friend about Jesus? What will happen if, as we're talking and we find out about issues that are having life, I offer to pray for them and start that conversation about God and about Jesus? What will happen? I don't know. But God has told us to do it. What will happen if I serve God in a new way? What will people think of me if I'm different? If I live out what I read in God's Word, how will people respond? Well, I don't know. But God said, go. So trust Him and go. Step out in faith. Don't let the unknown stop you from obeying Him. And this is key. Even if the future is unknown, God is not unknown. You know him, and he's got you. Trust him and live by faith. Now we're going to read just a few more verses of Abram's story this morning. He's been traveling through the land, headed south, and now he keeps going right out of the land. Look at chapter 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a beautiful woman in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, because but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what's this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And so, there's a famine in the land where Abraham is living. In other words, there's not enough food in the land. This is in the land that God had shown him, said this is the place. This is where he was supposed to go and live. And so, is it a problem that there is a famine in the land, that there's not enough food? Well, our natural response is yes, right? I mean, there's nothing to eat here. We need to do something about this. But the faith answer is it's not a problem for God. Did God tell Abraham to leave the land? You know, Abraham, we got a slight change of plans. I need you to head down to Egypt for a while because there's not enough food up here. No. In fact, it looks like Abraham didn't even check with God. He was just traveling and went on down the road. He simply assessed the situation, decided to go, and went. He had a little lapse of faith here. Now, let me tell you one thing. Faith will always be tested. Someone who is living by faith should not expect that everything is going to be smooth sailing. We need to recognize that trials are part of the life of faith. In fact, Peter says, don't be surprised when you experience them. In other words, expect hardships to come. But God uses those trials to grow our faith, to teach us, to help us to learn, to help us grow in faith. And so when you face trials, rely on God, trust Him, obey Him, and move forward in faith. But Abram goes down to Egypt. He goes down to Egypt where there's water from the Nile. And so there's going to be plenty of food, plenty of pasture. They're not relying on the rain. They get water from the Nile. And on his way down to Egypt, he comes up with a terrible plan. He says to Sarai, tell people you're my sister. Now, this is probably what Abram's thinking. Sarah is apparently very beautiful, even at her older age. And so he assumes that when men in Egypt see her, they will want to marry her. They will want her as their wife. But in that culture, marriages had to be arranged by a woman's father, or if dad was no longer around, by her brother. And so if they tell people that Abram is her husband, well, they'll just knock him off to get him out of the way. They'll just kill him so they could then take Sarai as, or one of them could take Sarai as his own wife. But if they tell people that she's his sister, well, then Abram's not in the way. They just have to deal with him. They would, when someone would approach him about marrying her, it would take some time for the arrangements. And in that time, they could get out of town, sneak out at night or whatever, but they could escape. And she apparently agrees with it. Good plan, Abram. But things don't work out exactly as planned. He probably didn't expect Pharaoh to notice her, the king to notice her. But he does. He hears about her beauty, and he wants her, so he takes her. You notice, he's Pharaoh, so he has the power to do that. There's no negotiating here. He just takes her. So she's gone, and there's nothing Abram can do about it. Now, why did this happen? Well, because Abram was afraid and trusted his own wisdom rather than God's. Fear is the enemy of faith. And sometimes we allow fear to stop us from trusting. But this is what we need to remember as believers in Jesus. God loves you. And whatever happens, you're in his hands. There might be something good, there might be something bad that happens, but whatever happens, you're in his hands. So rest in him. I remember one time I was on a trip. I was in college, and I was driving home for the summer. And I stopped at a gas station to get gas. And the guy who worked there came out and started telling me that my tires were bald and needed to be replaced, and said that there were blisters under the tread. I was a kid. I didn't know what to think. I'm like, really? And he kind of scared me a little bit. Really, it was just a high-pressure sales tactic. Dishonest. Mean. But I didn't know that. And I got a little worried. And I wasn't sure what to do. So you know what I did? I called someone who did. No. I called my dad. And I explained to him the situation. And my dad said, he's just trying to scare you. But tell him to show you where these blisters are. I said, okay. So I asked him, where are the blisters? They're all over the place there. There were no blisters on my tires. When you're scared, when you are in a situation that is bigger than you or that you don't understand, and when fear threatens to overcome your faith, remember who you belong to. God is our greatest resource. Call on him. He's here for us. Trust him. Call on him. So then what happens to Abram? Well, Pharaoh is so happy about Sarai, he gives Abram many expensive gifts. This is actually God's grace. Even at this time when Abram had failed, God helps him. And this is probably also a punishment on Pharaoh for just taking whoever he wanted. in order to satisfy his own desires. But God takes some of Pharaoh's stuff and gives it to Abram. And then God protects Sarah. He steps in to rescue her and to rescue Abram. And he steps in to preserve his promise to Abram that he would give Abram many descendants. But notice that Abram is rebuked by Pharaoh. He has done wrong, and he's rebuked by Pharaoh. He's put in his place by this ungodly man. Pharaoh says, "What did you do to me? Why did you tell me this? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Now then you ask, well, how did he know? Well, see, probably what happened was that Pharaoh's house, everyone was sick except for Sarai. And that would naturally cause you to talk to her and say, "What's going on with you? Why aren't you sick like the rest of us?" "Well, we had this dumb plan. This is what we said. This is how we got here." And so he goes. And he goes to Abram and he says, "Why? What? Why?" And then he says, "Get out of here. Get away from me. Take your wife and everything you have and get out of town." And he makes sure that Abram leaves because he gives him an escort. Abram is escorted out of Egypt in shame. But we see here that God didn't just quit on Abram when he messed up. God doesn't do that. He keeps his promises. God is merciful and gracious to his people. And when we fail, he doesn't disown us. Now, there very well may be consequences to our sin. And sin hinders our fellowship with God. But you're still his. And he waits for you to come to him to confess and then to continue in faith. So on the road of life, keep your eyes on God. Trust him. Live by faith. And when you mess up, when you sin, confess it and get right with him and get back in the right lane. And when God says go, go. And if he says stop, stop. Do this, do it. Don't do that, don't do it. So where are you headed? Are you going God's way? Moving down the road of faith? Or are you letting this world hold you back? Letting this world discourage you? Or letting this world scare you out of obeying? The truth is, we can all grow in faith. As we live this life, we are all learning to live by faith. And we will face challenges. We will be tested. But by God's grace and in his strength, we can live by faith. If you know what God has told you to do, then do it. Don't hesitate. If the future is unknown, well, trust in God, the one who you do know. And if you're afraid, put your faith in the Almighty God who loves you. The road can be a dangerous place, but God is with us.